What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 9, State, Society, and the Quest for Salvation in India. As usual, here's our intro. This chapter addresses the significant developments in classical India between about 520 BCE and 550 CE, during which two influential empires emerged in northern India, the Mauryan and the Gupta. Although these two state systems were not permanent, they contributed to the growth of long-distance trading networks, the consolidation of cultural traditions, and the promotion of several significant religions. More specifically, India, during this period of 1,000 years or so, witnessed the following important developments. Number one, a high volume of manufacture and trade within regions as far as East China and as far west as the Mediterranean basin. The consolidation of social traditions of patriarchal families and caste distinctions, later becoming more elaborate with the appearance of subcastes called jati, which were usually based on occupation. And finally, the emergence and spread of salvation-based religions, Jainism, Buddhism, and popular Hinduism. All right, so first up, a little bit of geography. I want to kind of show you guys the Mauryan and Gupta empires around the years 321 BCE and 550 CE. As you can see, it takes up most of India except for the most southern tip of the Indian peninsula. As you can see, we have kind of an overlapping area with the Gupta, but you can see the Mauryan Empire spreads very far north, all the way up to about the Hindu Kush. It butts up against like what would be known as Persia, and you can see these purple lines, which are starting to be the development of what is known as trade routes. We're going to get into a new kind of idea during this chapter of the significance of trade throughout the world, and this is the first example of global trade that we're going to actually see rise as a result of trade networks and trade routes that become established during this time. All right, so before we can even talk about the parts of India that we really want to focus on for this chapter, we have to start with a guy named Alexander the Great. In 520 BCE, Persian Emperor Darius conquers northwest India, and he introduces the Persian ruling pattern. This is the establishment of what is known as like bureaucracy and some of the more organized forms of government that we had seen in earlier Near Eastern or Middle Eastern cultures at the time. But then around 327 BCE, Alexander of Macedon destroys the Persian Empire in India. Alexander was considered one of the greatest generals of all time. He's still considered a great military commander, and some of his tactics are still studied to this day at military colleges and places where they study war. Alexander was known for traveling the world, and basically by the age of 25-ish, he had conquered most of what was known as the known world at the time. He only happens to stop, basically, not because he was losing, but basically because his troops mutiny and depart after 2 years. So he goes on these campaigns for a while, and his troops are no longer willing to follow him because they wanted to go home. Alexander still wanted to continue on fighting and conquering lands, but his troops didn't have the will to fight. During his absence, however, there's a political power vacuum that occurs in India. We then see the rise of the kingdom of Magadha, the most significant remaining kingdom after Alexander's departure. It's in the central Ganges plain, which is a big center part of India, or what we would know as India today. It has an economic strength that really sets it apart from other sections of this globe at the time, what we would call like the East, like India, China, is because they're starting with agriculture. Now, we talked about the importance of agriculture in the past as being able to provide for your people, provide for long-term growth of a civilization. It's one of the cornerstones of civilization. We also start to see the trade in the Ganges Valley and the Bay of Bengal. This trade led to the facilitation and creation of wealth that was unable to occur up to this point because India had not known or really interacted with the cultures of the Near East at the time. The kingdom of Magadha, eventually dominate the surrounding regions in northeast India. And then we get one of its big rulers, Chandragupta Maurya. He took advantage of power vacuum left by Alexander. He overthrew the Magadha rulers, and he expanded the kingdom to create the first unified Indian empire known as the Mauryan Dynasty. There's a famous picture that probably is Chandragupta Maurya at this time here on the right. Chandragupta's government. He had an advisor named Kautilya, and it was recorded in the Arthashastra, the Manual of Political Statecraft. Within the Arthashastra, it talked about foreign policy, some economics, some domestic policies. What's interesting about this is that during this time, there's the rise of these kind of manuals to describe how people should interact with their foreign neighbors and give advice based on previous rulers about how foreign rulers should really rule not only their own people with domestic policies, but also how it should conduct trade and how it should interact with those around them. To support Chandragupta's government, he had a large network of spies who spied on the people. The legend goes that Chandragupta eventually will retire to become a monk. He resigns himself from being a ruler and decides to become a monk. And he eventually will starve himself to death. So that's kind of the end of Chandragupta's government. We then get to the Ashoka Maurya. He's the grandson of Chandragupta, and he represents the high point of the Mauryan Empire. He ruled from 268 to 232 BCE. He expanded the empire to include all of the Indian subcontinent except for the south, which is that part I showed a little bit before. Positive rulership, integrated Indian society. If you think about it during this time, as with many cultures that we've studied, it's really difficult to try and get people to all be on the same side and to try and all be on the same team. You need to be a good ruler, you need to be a wise ruler. But if we look back to what we studied a little bit with China, the ideas of legalism, that sometimes you don't really want to follow somebody who has a very cruel outlook on life or a very negative outlook on the world itself. And he decides that having a positive way of dealing with the people will allow them to come together. And he's much better known as a ruler than a conqueror, meaning that he wasn't really known for being a warrior. He was known as being a very good statesman, very good person who oversaw lots of things, and that's kind of his contribution to history. We then get to the decline of the Mauryan Empire. There's an economic crisis that follows the death of the Ashoka. There's high costs of bureaucracy, military not supported by tax revenue. What happens during this time is there's a very high cost to running government. And if you have a bureaucracy, it's very efficient, but it takes lots of hands to oversee lots of the work that's going on within your society. And if you're not really careful, you can spend a lot of money on bureaucrats and really overlook some of the more basic necessities of what needs to happen. We talked about some of the parts of civilization as being you need bureaucrats to oversee things, you need a religious structure, you need artisans, craftsmen, but one of the main cornerstones you need before all of that is a military to make sure that when others come to try and take your things or to attack your people, that you have a strong group of people who are willing to fight and willing to hurt others so that you can keep what is yours. Now, under the new leaders of the Mauryan Empire, this high cost of bureaucracy is not able to channel a lot of the money towards the military through tax revenue. And so these military become very distraught over not being paid, basically. And in an effort to try and pay the people of the time, they devalue the currency to pay salaries. Now, devaluation works like this. If you, let's say, had a penny, you would not be a very rich person. It's only worth 1 cent, right? Now, if we go back in time to, say, the 1920s, 1 penny was worth a lot more in value to an individual person for goods compared to today. Now, the devaluation of currency is the government setting the price of the currency as a trade for some other good. So pretend that today a penny can't really buy you much. But let's say tomorrow the government, for whatever reason, or this is a very imperfect example, but let's say the government was able to say that 1 cheeseburger from McDonald's is now only 1 penny. Now, if the government rules and says that that's what it is, then other things that are related to those price points will have to change. If you think about how much money you have on you at any given time, like right now in my pocket, I think I have $20. For every penny I could buy 1 cheeseburger, I'm a very wealthy person in terms of how much food I could buy. But at the same time, I've now just hyper-inflated the value of what our currency is, meaning that my money can now go farther. Now, if we take the flip side example of that, let's say that the government said that a cheeseburger, for again, whatever reason in this imperfect example, at McDonald's is $20. Well, then the other goods in that society would need to fluctuate accordingly. So if a cheeseburger at McDonald's is $20, and how much is, for example, an iPhone? Or how much is your textbook? It would have to obviously raise relative to the price of what that good or service is worth. Now, by devaluing the currency to pay the salaries, the Mauryan Empire actually was able to solve one problem in the short term. By being able to say that the currency that the people were given is a lot less, meaning that they give them more and more money, but they are able to say that it doesn't buy as much. The soldiers were able to collect their normal paychecks, but the money that they were receiving wasn't worth a lot of goods or services because now the market, or all the money that people have, is worth less because now the soldiers have so much of the money that was printed as a result, or minted through metal, as a result of just handing out money. When you do this, people, for example, who had saved, let's say they saved $10,000, just to make this example simple, they'd save $10,000. Well, if a soldier gets $5,000 for a paycheck for 1 month, your $10,000 doesn't mean a lot compared to, say, a couple months before that, when $10,000 might have been worth a lot of money, or many years worth of work. And so this devaluation of currency to pay the salaries eventually causes the military to abandon the Mauryan Empire, and many of those regions don't see a point in supporting the Mauryan Empire as a result of this. And the Mauryan Empire eventually disappears by 185 BCE. We then get a regional kingdom called Bactria. It's established in northwestern India. It's ruled by Greek-speaking descendants of Alexander's campaigns. There's intense cultural activity that accompanies active trade. There's a couple things that I need you to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about trade. First of all, trade happens because people have a lot of a certain items, say a surplus of goods, which means extra goods. As they have this surplus of goods, they're able to say we don't need whatever this good is, and we're willing to trade it to others for things we might need. So for example, let's pretend in our classroom, you had bags and bags and bags and bags of rice. You had hundreds and hundreds of pounds of rice. Let's say in the average year, in your crop that you had collected from these, which is rice, you have enough saved that you could feed yourself, your family, and all those you loved with rice for the year. And let's say you had left over 20 bags of rice. Now you could let that rice sit there and just store it away, or you could trade it for other things that you might want. And so you might go out and find somebody who has some sort of meat that you could trade the rice for. And now they get rice, which makes them happy. They give up some extra meat that they don't need. And you guys work out what it is you think that you need to trade that good. Now, alongside of trade, as simply just being for keeping ourselves alive, there's this cultural activity that accompanies active trade. Cultural activity oftentimes can involve religion. It can involve the trading of ideas. It can involve the trading of culture, which is basically the structures of a society that help support knowledge about certain ideals, certain values, certain morals. It can also be things like art and architecture. And so as people are trading, they're also trading ideas about other things within their culture and their society. We also get another regional kingdom known as Kush. It's in northern India, Central Asia. It's around 1 to 300 CE. They maintain what is known as the Silk Road Trade Network. The Silk Road Trade Network is one of the most important ideas in world history, especially AP world history. I want you to make sure you put a little star by this slide. The Silk Road was one of the original trading networks that we as historians ever discovered when doing research. The Silk Road was super important because it linked basically China with its silk to India and to larger parts of the Near East / Middle East, which we would know as some of the cultures that we studied in the first 8 chapters. By maintaining the Silk Road trade network, here is what the Kingdom of Kush did. It was able to oversee the actual roads themselves to make sure that they were in good condition and carts and traders and things like that could travel along those routes safely. They also deployed what would be known today as like policemen to police the roads and make sure that nobody was getting robbed, nobody was getting harassed, and that there was like safe travel along those routes. Now, to pay for all this, the regional kingdom of Kush was able to collect taxes on traded goods that went along those routes. They would have different points at which people would pay tolls or they would pay taxes on the goods they were trading. And what's nice about that for the kingdom of Kush is it's very low investment for being able to make a lot of wealth. If you were a trader traveling, which one would you prefer? Would you rather prefer to find your own route and hopefully make it to wherever you're trying to go? Or would you rather be able to know where you are going along a certain pre-created route, and also knowing that there were some sort of police or guards that you could look to and kind of support one another through a caravan and keep yourself safe? And yeah, you'd have to pay a little bit of taxes here and there, but you could always just bring extra money, or you could trade some of your goods along the way to people like the people of Kush, and they would allow you safe passage along their roads. Now, maintaining the Silk Road trade network, you were able to collect lots of goods. You were able to also set up some markets where people wouldn't have to travel that far. Let's say you're traveling from China and you don't really want to go too far before you have to head back. Well, you can stop off somewhere along the way in Kush, drop off your goods, and maybe some other trader would pick up your goods and continue them along the route after they had purchased them from you, and hopefully moving them along, they might charge even more money to get them farther along the trade network. So it becomes a very important way of transporting not only goods, but also some ideas travel along these ways. Some of the religions that we're going to talk about in a little bit travel along this path. And people really are starting to interact in larger ways with one another through this process. All right, next up, here's the Silk Road Network. As you can see, it travels all the way from, in the top left, you can see parts of Greece and Turkey, and it goes all the way down through Egypt, and then it crosses all the way past the Hindu Kush, and it goes just in the northern, upper parts of what we would call Mongolia today, and then eventually ends up in the coast of China. But as you can see, here's the Kingdom of Kush. Here's more kind of addendum to Kush later on, and here's the Kingdom of Bactria. Now, these two kingdoms were able to basically maintain large sections of the Silk Road, especially through one of the more treacherous sections of the Silk Road, which crosses over some mountains and crosses over some areas where it might seem a little bit more problematic to travel. Next, we get to the Gupta Dynasty, based in Magadha. Founded by Chandragupta, no relation to Chandragupta Maurya, so you're going to have to try and keep those guys straight, around 320 CE. It's slightly smaller than the Mauryan Empire and it had a highly decentralized leadership. When we say decentralized leadership, what we mean is that the leadership wasn't centralized or centered in one individual. It's kind of a bureaucracy within a bureaucracy. The leadership had split itself amongst different groups. It had split itself amongst different peoples. And as a process of doing this, people controlled certain sections. It doesn't seem like to historians that there was one leader who controlled everything all the time consistently. It's more kind of what we'll see later on in world history, these kind of smaller states that kind of band together as like a confederation, but still pledging kind of allegiance as a dynasty to Chandragupta. It starts the foundations for studies in natural sciences and mathematics. We'll talk about those a little later. There's a Gupta decline. There's frequent invasion of white Huns in the 5th century CE. The Gupta dynasty disintegrates along regional fault lines as those regions we talked about kind of start to see parts of the Gupta Empire fall to the White Huns. They start to break off and kind of do their own thing. And when you don't have groups banding together to protect themselves from a larger enemy, people start to fall away. Smaller local kingdoms dominate until the Mughal Empire founded in the 16th century. So these smaller local kingdoms assert individual control over their certain regions, pledging allegiance to smaller regional leaders who will then take care of the people in that smaller regional area. As for the economy, we have towns and manufacturing. They manufactured goods in big demand and developed a dense network of small workshops. This trade intensified and capitalized on trade routes across India. Now, during this time, we see that these manufactured goods are in big demand because they start to develop these natural sciences and the ability to kind of do things like smelting. And one of the things that people start to demand a lot of is manufactured goods like textiles, like processes like smelting for metal, but also processes like creating porcelain through fire, like using fire in a kiln with clay. And this drives up the demand around this section of the world for people to try and get some of this technology, as it would be called, to their regions of the world. So as a result, these developing manufacturing areas created a dense network of small workshops, meaning that these were small craftsmen who became highly skilled in creating very specific things. Like if you were a smelter for metal, you might become really, really good at doing that. And as a result, you're going to make sure that you get paid really well for your ability to smelt metal. This trade during this time is intense, and it capitalizes on trade routes across India. What's great about this process is kind of natural to understand. If, let's say, you were really good at smelting metal, and other people around you weren't, what you could do is not really go very far to be able to trade. If one of the limitations that happened as a craftsman was many times you were really good at making and doing your craft, but maybe you weren't really great at running a business to sell those things. And even then, you might not have a market, meaning people who want to buy your things within your immediate area. But if people, for example, came to you along trade routes and they saw what you were making and they say, wow, this is really great. We would love to take this back with us, but we need a lot to make it worth our while. What they might do is they might say to you, we're going to put in an order, have your artisans or your craftsmen go out and make a lot of this good and then bring it back to this part of the town, which isn't very far away for you. And we will then bring you some goods or some money, and then we'll trade. And then we'll take it back home, and you don't have to worry about transporting it. For you, this sounds like a great idea. For them, they don't have to spend all this time learning how to get their craftsmen to do it well, and everyone's kind of happy, and they move on from there. This leads to long-distance trade, which is a Persian connection since Cyrus and Darius. There are massive road-building projects under Persian rule. Again, we go back to the Persian rule under Darius, and we see that the people who were bringing in that bureaucracy saw the need for maintained roads, seeing the need for the ability to transport troops, basically, was the point of the roads, very quickly to wherever rebellions were happening. But the side benefit of having these massive road building projects is the economic advantage you have by being able to have trade along those roads, and then you would be able to tax them or have tolls along those routes and increase your empire's monies or goods as a result of that. Alexander then extends trade west to Macedon, making this larger long-distance trade network grow, and there are trade routes through the Kush Mountains, the Silk Road. We saw that a little earlier when I showed you the map. Here it is again. Now, first we have what's known as the Royal Road, which is under the Achaemenid Persian Empire. As you can see, it's partially in green, but it goes all the way out a little bit to the yellow. And then we have what's known as the First Silk Road, which is Roman-controlled around 30 BCE. We're going to see that soon when we talk about Rome. And then there's later additions to the Silk Road, which reach all the way to China. Next, we get trade in the Indian Ocean basin. Now, if you think about it, one of the things that people really were afraid of during this time was the ocean. Imagine yourself being a trader, and you'd like to trade your goods across this Silk Road network. You know there's lots of people out there that maybe want your goods, but you're not really sure how to get it to them. You know there's the Silk Road, which has lots of tolls. There's a threat of robbers. There's a threat of different people just coming along and charging you taxes that might not work for the government, and maybe there's just lots of perils along the way. So you might think to go into the ocean, right? But at this time, they didn't really have a lot of knowledge of the ocean. Now, imagine yourself being a trader wanting to go on the ocean, and you don't have any access to modern weather patterns, to modern scientific equipment that's able to tell you what the weather will be. You're really not able to really predict what's going to happen out on the ocean. But what people quickly figure out in the Indian Ocean basin is that there is a spring, summer, fall, winter kind of cycle that happens every year, and people are able to use this to their advantage to continue trading along the Indian Ocean basin. So in the spring and the summer, the winds blow from the southwest, meaning the bottom left of a compass, they blow from that direction towards the top right of the compass. And then in the fall, winter, the winds blow from the northeast, meaning the top right, they blow all the way down to the bottom left. Now, if you know this predictable pattern, you can create sails for your ships, and you can use that wind to your advantage because you don't need big crews to row your boats all along those ocean currents. You can do it pretty much by having a small crew with lots of goods in your hull of your ship, and you can make lots of money doing this. This sets up trade from Asia to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. This is a huge change and shift in trading during this time because people are able now to take two routes to move goods. And many traders saw this as an advantageous time during world history because they were able to avoid many of those tolls. There's no toll roads on the ocean many times. And even if people saw you going by, they probably wouldn't go out and try and stop your ship because they were afraid of the ocean too. But what's nice about this is they're able to move goods an alternative way. So if there was, for example, violence or war that was happening on land, it probably wasn't happening so much in the ocean. Here's an example of this wind pattern. This is known as the monsoons or the monsoon seasons that happen during this time. Now with these winds, you're able to kind of harness the wind, move your stuff up and down the coast of India during the Indian Ocean Basin. And as you can see, the purple trade routes actually kind of help in the Bay of Bengal, moving it to the east if needed. And many of this seafaring peoples were able to move their goods all the way from India to China and back. Next, I found this little video that talks about the wind patterns in modern day. I'd like to play this for you so you can get a chance to kind of see what it's like from a more scientific perspective. So go ahead and watch this.
The monsoon is a seasonal rain and wind pattern that was first described over South Asia. You see the clouds blossoming here during the summer part of the monsoon. For centuries, people have known about it, but only recently have we received enough data from satellites to really describe what's going on.
What you can see here is moist air that has evaporated from the ocean coming across India and providing rainfall driving the monsoon season. The great thing about GPM is that it allows us to see precipitating systems as a whole over land and oceans, and then as they transition from one boundary to the next.
All of this rainfall drives soil moisture over land. It's beneficial because it promotes the economic activity that people depend on. For example, agriculture. As well, it fills the rivers, which provides water for human activity and the natural environment, as well as transportation. If the rivers get too full, of course, it becomes flooding. At first, the floods you see here are fairly minor and broad scale, but then they concentrate in the few wiggly lines, which are the river basins, for example, in central eastern China.
In mountainous regions, when the ground becomes saturated due to heavy rains, it can lead to landslides. Landslides kill thousands of people every year and are primarily triggered by rainfall. They are especially common within the Himalayan region each monsoon season.
One really cool way to look at the monsoon is to do a split screen and look at the summer and the winter at the same time. In the summer, the wind is blowing onshore, bringing the moist, rain-laden air into the continent. In the wintertime, it blows off the continent.
Now, those winds are basically driven by temperature differences between the ocean and the land. And where the land is nice and warm, the air expands and it draws in the moist air from the ocean waters. But in the wintertime, it's very cold. The moisture then goes from the continent back into the oceans.
So now you have a little bit better understanding about the monsoon patterns that still occur even to this day. Next, we'll get to society. We'll talk about gender relations. The patriarchy was entrenched. Pater meaning father. Archy meaning to rule. The rule of the father was entrenched or part of their culture from basically the very beginning we've been talking about. Child marriage was common. 8-year-old girls married to men in their 20s. Now, you might think of this as being kind of icky. Many times, people during this time did not consummate or have sex with their brides until they were of mature enough age to be able to procreate or have babies. And this 8-year-old married to men in their 20s thing was more a societal practice, more about entrenching family relations, entrenching, kind of making sure that people were set up. If you were a girl during this time, you weren't really valued that much because you weren't seen as providing anything good to the culture. How some of them really didn't see their girls as being valuable other than really farming. And even then, men were kind of seen as more valuable to that process. So the only thing girls really did was take up space. And so many families saw it as a good thing or a burden lessening for the family to be able to marry off their daughters. Many times there were dowries associated with this, and dowries are gifts from the bride's family to the husband to set them up on a new life. Some critics have commented that many times this process of basically paying for a new family to take their daughters off their hands and take care of them is kind of chauvinistic and really terrible towards girls in general. But what they saw was that this child marriage process kind of helped out the family overall. Women were encouraged to remain in the private sphere, meaning that they were encouraged to not really speak too loudly, not really participate in public life in terms of politics, not really be part of culture as the development of culture. And they were really seen as being kind of just around, but not really a part of the development of making things like culture happen. Next, I have what's known as the social order. I'd like you to kind of draw this little chart. I think it's helpful to understand that during this time in India, this is the establishment of the caste system. The caste system, which is spelled on the next slide, is a structure to society that shows classes across the societies of India. Now, many of us have an understanding of class system as being like, for example, the super rich, and then like middle class, and then like poor people or people in poverty. And that's based more on a relationship to money. During this time, they saw this social order, or this caste system, or this class system based on the jobs that many of these people did. So it didn't really have a ton to do with how much money you owned, which coincidentally, many of these jobs that are at the very top make more money than those at the very bottom. So first up, you have the gods, the very top, and they're just kind of separate from this whole group. But they're above. They're in charge, right? And then we have at the top what are known as Brahmin. Those are priests and academics. The Brahmin were seen as valuable and structured in society to be at the top because they were the ones who connected us to the gods. If we didn't know what the gods wanted, we would be in trouble. So we need these priests and smart people to kind of help us along to understand what the gods want because they're the ones ultimately in charge. Below them are Kshatriya. Those are warriors and kings. Many times they're closely related. These warriors were people who went out and fought. Again, we talked about how if you don't have people who go out and fight, you don't really have a society. So the warriors were very valued, and then the kings, the people who were ruling. Underneath them, they have Vaishya, which are merchants and landowners, people who traded goods, and people who owned land, which would be then used for agriculture. Below them were Sudra, commoners, peasants, servants. These are people who just kind of work. They do jobs. They probably don't have very good jobs, but they, like, for example, are agricultural workers, people who work in the fields, people who did jobs like helping move things off of boats, people who did like heavy labor, people who just like lifted things or used their bodies to manipulate like things like cutting down trees or mining, that kind of stuff. And then below even the Sudra were what was known as the untouchables, the outcasts or out of caste. They're not even part of the caste system. These are people like street sweepers, latrine cleaners, people who took care of the cremation of bodies. These people were considered like untouchable or unclean because they did the jobs that many people saw as super dirty. A street sweeper wasn't someone who just kind of went around and swept the streets, but many times they got sick because they were interacting with human waste. Latrine cleaners, again, interacting with human waste. They were prone to sickness. And then dead bodies carry many diseases. And so people didn't really want to interact with this, but they saw them as a very integral part of society that needed to be built up. So here's the caste system. It goes all the way back to Aryan times. We have the Brahmins again, the priests, the Kshatriyas, warriors, the Vaishyas, the peasants, and the Sudras and the serfs. And then we have the out of caste or outcasts. Now, within the caste, there's increasing economic diversification challenges simplistic caste system. As people can kind of tell, and as you probably can tell, if you look at that original triangle that I had you draw and kind of label, you'll see that there are some jobs that aren't labeled on there. And it's kind of hard to say where some jobs should fit in. For example, what if you were somebody who had a skilled artisan job, like you were somebody who made pots, but you did artistry on those pots and you made it very well, and people from all around wanted your goods. Well, you're not just a common laborer, because common laborers basically just do labor that is really hard and doesn't take a lot of like skill all the time to do. But you're also not really a warrior, because you're not somebody who hurts people, but you're still valuable to this whole process. So what ends up happening is the caste system becomes too simplistic, and they start to form what's known as jati, which are guilds that acted as subcaste. Now, a guild is considered a unification or a union of people who all do the same job and kind of enforce standards across multiple shops or workshops. Now, imagine again back to that example of pottery maker. Let's say there was like you, but you belong part of a jati that was the pottery maker jati. So what you would do is you would make your pots, but maybe there was like a technique that you as a group of pottery makers knew that made your pots really shiny or made them really like hard to the elements and didn't break as easily. Well, you would enforce the social order and make sure that your goods were being traded fairly, that the prices were being traded at a specific rate, and that people were kind of understanding that like they couldn't do your job unless you like taught them and let them. And they kept these secrets very closely guarded within certain jati so that they didn't lose out on work. Now, with the jati, because of the caste system, they had to kind of enforce the social order, saying that, no, we're not just common laborers, we're actually somewhere in between, and we need to enforce that. We are not just like low class, so we should have certain rights, we should have certain benefits. And these outcasts were forced into low status employment. These are the people who were not skilled as jati, they weren't skilled as commoners, but they still did some kind of jobs that people needed done, and the jati really enforced that this is who's going to do those jobs. And many times within a caste system, this is a family-based job system. So if your father was somebody who cremated bodies, then you would be somebody who cremated bodies as well. And if you were somebody who made pottery, you would be allowed into the jati of pottery makers if your father was somebody who was a part of the jati of pottery makers. Next, we have wealth and the social order. There's upward social mobility. It was possible for Vaishyas and Sudras, and wealth challenges the Varna class for status. There was possible mobility. You could eventually move up, hopefully, within your caste, but if you try and see this system as a relationship not to money, but to what good they provide to the society overall, you could see that people started off with a very basic and simplistic understanding of the caste system. But over time, as trading happened and as people gained wealth doing certain actions, what do you start to do with the people who have more wealth than what their class really demands? Like, for example, you might have somebody who's like the best of the commoners for farming, and maybe they have organized a family that's like some of the best agricultural workers out there. Well, maybe they make lots of money, save their money well, and now they have more money than, say, some warrior who's been spending all the money he's ever gotten, and now he's super poor. Yet in the class system, the warrior is actually higher than the commoner. How do you deal with that? And so this wealth and social order gets challenged by during this time. Next, we get to the religions of salvation in classical India. Social change generated resentment of caste privilege. You start to see that there's kind of an issue that's starting to rise. As people make more money, how come the people at the top of the caste system are seen in such high regard or valued more than those at the bottom, even if the people at the bottom have more money than those at the top? Well, you might start to say, okay, what we need to do is figure out and look at this system. Well, one of the big things that people had at this time that made them kind of really pissed off was looking at the Brahmins. The Brahmins, as being priests, were free from taxation. They didn't even have to pay taxes, yet they got a lot of the government services like protection from the military, some of the bureaucracy, some of the more government organized processes, and they got those for free, while others had to pay a lot of money for that same service, for those same services through taxes. And around the 6th or 5th century BCE, new religions and philosophies challenge the status quo. We get the Charvakas, which are atheists. This is some of the first time in world history that atheists show up. People who do not believe there are any gods or a god above, that we are just here and that there is no divine realm, that basically it's just all we see is what there is. And these atheists start to challenge that if there is no afterlife, why is it that we must actively participate in this caste system? One of the things that people would start to say about the caste system is like, well, when you die, it's all the same, so you'll be fine, we'll be equal. But now your job is to be like an outcast and you have to burn the bodies. But when we die, we'll all be in heaven and we'll be equal. And the Charvakas were saying, no, when we die, we'll be dead and there'll be nothing left. So we need to change the system now. We also get 3 other groups known as Jainists, Buddhists, and Hindus, which we'll talk about in just a sec. Now, under Jainism, we have Vardhamana Mahavira in 540 to 468 BCE. This wise spiritual monk abandons a privileged family to lead an ascetic life. Ascetic means a life of denial, someone who doesn't really enjoy the pleasures of life like food or companionship or drinking or anything that really brings you a ton of pleasure. Many times the ascetics lived in the middle of the woods with very little food, many times just meditating by themselves, not spending a lot of time on their appearance or making sure that they were well taken care of, but really focusing on the spiritual aspect of their lives. During the 7th century, the movement is promoted based on the Upanishads. There's an emphasis on selfless living and concern for all beings. The Jainists believe that we shouldn't really focus on ourselves, but focus on others. And that not only just others, for example, in people, but also all beings. Jainists, for example, are very famous for not killing bugs. If there, for example, a fly lands on your arm, you, as a Jainist, would look at your arm and just kind of and blow the fly away. You wouldn't try and smack it and kill it, even if there were thousands of flies around, because you're having respect for the right of all beings to live and exist. And so your job is to just kind of get it off of you and let it continue along. Or maybe even you don't care that it lands on you and you just kind of ignore it. This kind of movement away from the self kind of helps to kind of lessen tensions between the caste system, because you don't really stress so much about what others are doing, and you see like, hey, yeah, this is my place in life, and I'm going to focus on my religion and myself and my faith, and then let my just job be a part of that, but not really focus on trying to better myself, but rather concerned that like, hey, my working in the fields, that helps other people, and that's kind of just a good thing for the whole universe. The Jainists had this kind of principle that kind of arises a couple different times in human history. We're going to look at it right now. It's called Ahimsa. It's a principle of extreme nonviolence. Jainists sweep the earth, strain water, use slow movements to avoid killing insects. They believe that there is no acceptable use of violence ever. If somebody decides that they're going to jump you, beat you up, and take all your money, you allow them to do whatever they're going to do. They don't believe in using violence because they believe that violence is a self-perpetuating process, that the more violence creates more violence and creates more violence, and it's a never-ending cycle. So the Jainists believe that using non-violence as a resistance or reaction to violence would eventually make the world or the universe whole. So Jainists, for example, sweep the earth around them to move the bugs away, the ants, so they don't accidentally step on ants or any other animals. They strain water so they don't accidentally drink any water and kill them, or any bugs and kill them. And they use slow movements. They keep an eye out on the ground. They try not to bump into things that might squish bugs. And Ahimsa continues to inspire modern movements. For example, Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But this extreme nonviolence becomes a very radical way to fight back against violence. There's an appeal to Jainism because it rejected the caste and jati distinctions. They didn't believe that you needed to worry so much about your caste because you're living for others, and so that's all an illusion. We don't need to really focus on that. There's an obvious appeal to underprivileged groups because it's not so much focused on telling people that they need to do certain things like rise up from their station, but rather just kind of see themselves as part of a bigger plan and allow it just to happen. But asceticism is too extreme to become a mass movement. Many people don't want to go and live in the forest with just a bowl. And so it doesn't really gain a lot of popularity, and that slow movement doesn't really lend itself to working out well for regular life. Many people aren't really concerned that much with stepping on ants. Many people aren't really concerned with squishing bugs, especially if the bugs are bothering them. And people don't believe, for example, in oftentimes, if somebody's going to beat you up, you kind of want to fight back to maybe protect yourself from dying. We also get to early Buddhism. We get Siddhartha Gautama. He probably was born in 563 to 483 BCE. He was a prince. Story goes, he leaves the palace one day after living a life of privilege, and he encounters a couple different things. First, he sees old age, he sees somebody sick, and then he sees somebody dead in the streets, and then he sees a monk. And after this, he starts to kind of worry himself, and eventually he abandons his comfortable life and becomes a monk. Now, during this time, he goes out and he does intense meditation and extreme asceticism. It's said that the Buddha almost killed himself by almost starving himself to death, that he meditated for many days. At one point, he meditates for over 49 days of meditation under what's known as the Bodhi tree to achieve enlightenment or understanding. And he attains the title of the Buddha, or the enlightened one, someone who has realized the greatness of, or the truth of the universe. Now, early on, under this intense meditation and extreme asceticism, the Buddha realizes that it's not going to work. And so he has to actually kind of find this middle ground. And Buddhism is very big in kind of finding the middle-ish path to a lot of things. The Buddha and his followers. He begins teaching his new doctrine around 528 BCE. His followers owned only robes, food, and bowls. Actually, food bowls. They didn't really own food. They begged for food. He had a life of wandering, begging, meditation, and the establishment of monastic communities, or communities where monks would just practice this wandering, begging, meditation process. Now, the Buddhist doctrine is known as the Dharma, or the teaching. I need you to make sure you put a little star by this because this is a big idea in world history, especially the idea of Buddhism. There are four noble truths to the Buddhist doctrine. Number one is that all life is suffering. The Buddha believed that all of life is just suffering because we're always in pain because we don't have something. We don't have those new Jordans. We don't have enough food. We don't have a big house. We're not popular enough. The girl doesn't like us. That boy doesn't like us. Our lives are incomplete in some way, so it results in suffering as an incompleteness. The Buddha believed that the second noble truth is that there is an end to suffering, that it is possible to end suffering. And the only way to end suffering, number three, is to remove desire from ourselves to get rid of suffering. If we don't no longer desire Jordans or the girl to like us or the guy to like us or to be popular, if we were able to remove that desire within us to want those things, then eventually we end suffering. And the only way to do this process is to do the eightfold path, which includes right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. By doing this eightfold path, we will eventually remove desire, which will end suffering, and then our life will no longer be in pain of suffering. And this will help alleviate us of the problem that is life and the suffering that comes as a part of it. Now, there's a great appeal to Buddhism. There's less dependence on Brahmins for ritual activities. You don't need to go to the Brahmins to figure out what the gods want because it doesn't matter what the gods want. They're kind of doing their own thing. Your job is to end suffering, and the only way to end suffering is to end desire and to follow the eightfold path, and that will make you happy. There is no recognition of caste or jati status because the Buddha believed that this is all an illusion. The whole world is just this weird illusion that we have put on ourselves. It's like putting on glasses that make the world different colors. As we look through the glasses, we think that some things might be red or some things might be green. And depending on the glasses we're wearing, it kind of colors the way we look at the world. The Buddha believed that this is all, the whole world, all this like desire is just an illusion that we need to take off or shed from ourselves so that we could truly be happy. So if that's the case, then jati, subcaste, caste, everything that we can think of that consists of our world is all just an illusion that we've made up to make ourselves either happy or not happy. And if we desire to move up in our caste, well, that's not good because we're trying to get rid of desire. And if we desire to have more money to make ourselves more valuable to society, well, that's not true, or that's not good because we're desiring something again. So they don't really recognize the caste or jati system. It's also a philosophy of moderate consumption. The Buddha rejected extremism. He didn't believe that you needed to starve yourself to death to be someone who reached enlightenment. He did believe in meditation, but moderate meditation, making sure that you're finding balance in all things. He believed in eating, but in moderate eating, finding balance in all things. That you were somebody who gave to charity, but moderate in all things. You didn't give away everything, especially not your robe or your bowl. They also believed in public service through lay teaching. You can earn some like credit or like karma to your like universal cred by going around and teaching others about the Buddha's Eightfold Path and telling stories about the Buddha and sharing the ideas of the Buddha and teaching others to meditate and teaching others about the way of the Dharma. They also used the vernacular. They spoke in the language of the people. They didn't speak in Sanskrit, which is some of what the other religions did, which meant that you had to learn Sanskrit, which was not a language that was spoken at that time by many people. And monasteries become an important institutions in Indian society. Many monasteries become places of community meetings. They become places of food distribution. They become places of prayer. They become places of just kind of general parts of where the government could kind of interact with the society because everyone kind of knew, oh yeah, the monastery. Everyone go to the monastery. We're going to do some stuff with the government. Okay, and everyone went there. The Ashoka supported Buddhism. There was a personal conversion to Buddhism. He was saddened after a violent war with the Kalinga, and he banned animal sacrifices and mandated vegetarianism in his court. Again, the Buddha believed that killing animals was wrong because the Buddha's beliefs kind of go back to as we end desire and we try to end suffering, we might not finish that goal in this lifetime. And the Buddha believed we got like second chances and many, many chances, and that our soul that's inside of us is eternal, and that eventually when we die, we'll just come back as something else. If you were really good, you would probably come back as somebody who was doing good things. So you would come back as maybe someone up above the caste, or someone who had more time to study, or someone who was able to do more charity with more money. And if you were did very bad things, you would move down. Maybe you'd end up as like a dung beetle or as like a dog to a very mean master because of the bad life you lived. And so our whole life just kind of is a circle of life, death, and rebirth. That as that kind of circle keeps going, the only way out of that circle is through enlightenment, as the Buddha had reached. And then we have ended desire and we no longer need to come back, and we've kind of reached nirvana, which is like releasing from the system of life, death, and rebirth. This banning of animal sacrifices and vegetarianism is a kind of homage or kind of reaction to that, which I just talked about. And he provides, the Ashoka, material support for Buddhist institutions and missionary activities, material support in food and money for their teaching and sharing of their religion. There is some changes in Buddhist thought. Around the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, the Buddha becomes considered divine. At first, he was just a man who reached some sort of enlightenment, and you too could be like the Buddha. But eventually, during the 3rd century to the 1st century, they considered the Buddha kind of like God-like or almost like a saint, and they set up what's called the Bodhisattvas, which is like saints. So the Buddha becomes kind of someone to emulate more so than somebody who's like a story that we just kind of remind ourselves of, and that the Buddha was special, and that you too can be special. You can be like a saint, and what you need to do is follow the Buddha's path. But what might happen one day is that we will study your story because you were such a good follower of the Eightfold Path. There's also a change as charitable donations to monastery is regarded as a pious activity. Let's say you were someone who wanted to practice the Noble Eightfold Path, but you didn't have lots of time to meditate. You have to, I don't know, go be a dock worker, but you really desperately want to reach enlightenment, and you realize the truth of this like religion, and you want to do something positive. Well, what you could do instead of just meditating all day or following the Eightfold Path constantly and giving up your job is donate to the monastery. And the monks will give you some, universal credit towards being a good person, and by doing this, it's seen as being pious or someone who believes in what you're doing, and it's kind of like meditating. It's not an equivalency, but it helps you along your path of relieving suffering. We then get to the spread of Mahayana Buddhism, which is Mahayana means greater vehicle or newer development. It takes root in India, China, Japan, Korea, Central Asia. This is compared to Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle, also Theravada, which is the earlier version. It takes root in Ceylon, Burma, and Thailand. I always like to take this point to make a joke that within the concepts of Buddhism, I always thought that Hinayana was probably more valuable, if nothing else, for the joke that within the Buddha's own understanding that the desire for anything is what leads to suffering, why would somebody want a greater vehicle? Doesn't that promote more desire, that we need to have a better vehicle? So we need to have the lesser vehicle, which is the lower vehicle, or the simple vehicle, and that will get us there anyways. I just think that's always kind of funny when you look at it. We then get to the place called Nalanda. It's a Buddhist monastery. It's like a university, sort of, in Buddhism and Hindu texts. Philosophy, astronomy, medicine is being taught there. It's kind of a big place where everybody kind of gathers, and it hits its peak at the end of the Gupta Dynasty. It helps spread Indian thought and kind of develops what's known as the mathematical number of 0. At this point in human history, people didn't really have a concept of nothing. It's a really complicated idea. There's always something. If there's an empty room, there's still the room, and there's still you within the room, and there's still light, which allows you to see the room. And even in darkness, there's still darkness. There's not nothing. And so by having this conversation within Nalanda, people start to talk about like nothingness as being emptiness, but not just the emptiness, but nothing, 0, nada, nothing. It's a really complicated philosophical idea if you really slow yourself down and think about it. But it also helps out in keeping track of numbers. It allows us to eventually get to larger, what we would call Arabic numbers we use today, like 1, 2, 3, like the ones you think of in your head when I start saying those numbers. Those are wholly reliant when we start getting to the tens on a 0 as a placeholder, which represents nothing, but also signifies a jump in the numerical value of something. We then get to Hinduism. It's a composition of epics from older oral traditions. We have Mahabharata and Ramayana. There are two older oral traditions that are written down. There's emphasis on the god Vishnu and his incarnations. We get to the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Song of the Lord. Its centuries of revisions and final form comes around 400 CE. It's a dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna during their civil war. The difference between Hinduism and Buddhism is that there is an emphasis in Hinduism on gods. There are gods in the sky or out in space somewhere, and they're doing their thing. And they've been having kind of relationships, or they've been having wars, and they've been having kind of interactions with each other kind of separate from us. And some of their actions have resulted in us doing stuff and becoming. But for example, you have someone like Shiva. And Shiva is the goddess of creation and destruction. So she creates things, but she can also destroy things. And so when something gets created, it's kind of like Shiva inspiring it. And when something gets destroyed, it's Shiva destroying it. And you can see how those two ideas are closely interlinked. Now, within Buddhism, there isn't really a sense of gods per se. There might be some gods out there, but it's more focused on this like life-death cycle of rebirth thing. And the Buddha wasn't considering himself a god, and neither did his early followers. They didn't see him as being like a god come to earth, but they thought that he was just a wise man who taught them about the true nature of the universe. This is opposed to Hinduism, where people are actually believing that there is gods out there doing stuff, and that we are kind of needing to either please them or interact with them or kind of acknowledge their presence in our history through time and space, and we need to be a part of their worship through this process. Under Hindu ethics, obedience to religious and moral laws, also known as the Dharma, or the truth, or the teaching, right? There's pursuit of economic well-being and honesty. You need to try and be economically well for yourself, and you need to be honest when you deal with people with money. You also need to enjoy social, physical, and sexual pleasure. You need to make sure that you're not just sitting in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do, no friends, you're not happy because you're dying of hunger and you're alone, not getting any. They say that in Hinduism that you need to have all three of those well balanced, but it needs to be enjoyed. And that eventually you'll get to the salvation of the soul, or moksha. That eventually your soul can be saved and you can reach heaven as a result of practicing good Hindu ethics of following religious and moral laws, and also being honest and enjoying life. So this is almost opposed to what Buddhism was saying, where it was about eliminating desire. The Hindus would say that desire is good, especially if you enjoy something. You should learn to enjoy something and be positive about the enjoyment of that. But you should also be honest and good and try and do things the best you can. There's a popularity to Hinduism. It gradually replaced Buddhism in India, mostly because Buddhism is very much about an ascetic religion. Ascetic religions don't do very well because it asks you to give up a lot of things. Religions that are ascetic oftentimes don't want you to have boyfriends or girlfriends or wives or husbands. They don't want you to eat till you're full. They don't want you to especially have friendships. They don't want you to really focus on this life. They want you to focus on the next life. Hinduism, on the other hand, is really positive. It sounds very happy. You just do a couple nice things. You make sure you're not lying and cheating and stealing, and you enjoy yourself, and you do, you're honest and you do the right things. Well, that's a lot easier than the Buddhism stuff. The Gupta dynastic leaders extend considerable support to Hinduism, overtaking Buddhism in India as a result of their positive outlook towards Hinduism. We have made it. When you have finished studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Explain the rise and fall of the Mauryan dynasty. Next, compare and contrast the emergence of regional kingdoms and the revival of the empire in India. Next, explain the rise of towns and trade across India during the classical period. Next, explain important aspects of family life and the caste system. Next, compare and contrast the features of classical Indian salvation religions. I spent a lot of time on that. And finally, discuss the emergence and impact of popular Hinduism. Here's your writing assignment. Write a short 5-sentence response. Number 1, even though the Mauryan and Gupta empires were highly influential, Indian history is largely characterized by small regional kingdoms. Why do you think large empires did not take hold in India as they did in other parts of the world we have studied? What is unusual or different about Indian culture in this respect? Number 2, how did the social customs of India, especially family patriarchy and caste, and classical Hinduism mesh? How do the practices and belief reinforce each other? And finally, Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism all emerged in India during this period. How did each one appeal to people? Did each one appeal to different groups of people? Why? How did their popularity develop through this period? Now, just differently than before, I have wanted to have you guys really reread your chapter, but I also found this really good video on YouTube. I hope it stays up as long as possible. Here's the bit.ly link so you can watch it. It's by Michael Wood, The Story of India. It's part 1. It kind of goes over a lot of the things I talked about, especially with the early rise of Alexander and the Khyber Pass, which we'll talk about next time, and some of the early foundations of Buddhism and Hinduism within India. So, as always, it's been good to talk to you. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. Please watch this video. Please reread your chapter. I will see you guys soon. Bye.
What we do here is go back.